I learned that night that every machine I built carried within it the weight of a soul I might destroy. The Duke proved it when he crossed my threshold at midnight, holding in his gloved hands the very device I had sworn no one would ever find. The laboratory went dark exactly as the city clocks struck 12. I was alone, as I always was at that hour, surrounded by the hum of electrical coils and the soft ticking of brass chronometers embedded in the walls. My workshop occupied the third floor of a narrow building in Clerkenwell, a place the maps called a printing house, but which had become something far stranger under my tenure. The air smelled of heated copper and ozone. Blue sparks danced across the surface of my primary conductor array, a web of wires strung between iron pillars like the nervous system of some vast, sleeping creature. I had been adjusting the resonance calibration on a secondary device, my fingers moving with practiced precision among the vacuum tubes and gear assemblies, when every lamp, every electrostatic globe, every filament in every bulb went suddenly, utterly black. My heart seized. I stood frozen in the suffocating darkness, my breath shallow, my mind racing through possibilities, a severed cable, an overloaded transformer, sabotage. The silence was enormous, broken only by the faint whine of capacitors discharging and the distant, ever-present rumble of the steam engines that powered the factories along the canal. Then I heard it. The sound of the street door opening 3 floors below. Footsteps on the iron staircase, slow and deliberate. The tread of expensive boots on metal grating. No one had a key to that door. No one even knew this place existed. Not as it truly was. I moved by memory through the blackness, my hands finding the cold steel of the workbench, the edge of a gear shaft, the smooth glass of a vacuum tube. My fingers closed around the small electric torch I kept for emergencies, and I twisted the switch. A narrow beam of white light cut through the dark, illuminating motes of dust suspended in the air like 1,000 tiny stars. I turned toward the door just as it opened. He stood in the doorway, a figure cut from shadow and gaslight, tall and utterly still. His coat was black wool, exquisitely tailored, his collar high and his cravat flawlessly tied despite the late hour. In the dim spill of light from the stairwell behind him, I could see the hard line of his jaw, the severe elegance of his features, and the cold, unreadable expression in his gray eyes. But it was what he held in his hands that froze the breath in my throat. The device. My device. The one I had hidden in a lead-lined case beneath a false floor in the cellar 2 months ago. The one I had told myself I would never use, never show, never let exist in the world of men who would not understand what it meant. He stepped into the room, and the door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. Neither of us spoke. The beam of my torch caught the brass and glass of the mechanism cradled in his hands, and I saw the faint glow of residual charge still flickering in its core, the crystalline chamber at its heart pulsing with a sickly greenish light. It was active. Someone had used it. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Who are you?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked forward into the workshop, his gaze sweeping over the arrays of equipment, the humming coils, the intricate lattice of wires and pistons and electromagnetic relays that filled the space like the guts of some impossible machine. When he finally looked at me, his expression was not one of anger or accusation, but something far more dangerous: exhaustion, grief held under ruthless control. "I am the Duke of Ashcroft," he said, and his voice was low and precise, each word carved from stone. "And you are the woman who built the machine that destroyed my sister's mind." I felt the floor shift beneath me, though I knew it was only my own body struggling to remain upright. I had never met the Duke of Ashcroft. I had heard his name, of course. Everyone in London had heard his name. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, a peer who sat in the House of Lords, a figure spoken of in the drawing rooms and clubs with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was also, I knew from the whispered gossip that reached even my isolated corners, a man who had lost his sister to some mysterious ailment 6 months ago. She had not died. She had simply stopped being herself. I forced myself to speak, though my mouth was dry. I did not destroy anyone. I built a prototype, a theoretical model. It was never meant to be used. He took another step closer, and now I could see the faint tremor in his hands, the only crack in his otherwise perfect composure. He set the device down on my workbench with a care that bordered on reverence, as though it were something sacred and profane at once. Then he turned to face me fully, and I saw the shadows beneath his eyes, the lines of sleeplessness etched into his skin. "Someone used it," he said, "on Eleanor, my sister. She woke one morning with no memory of her life, no recognition of her own name, no knowledge of who she was or who we were to her. The physicians found no injury, no disease, no physical cause. But I found this." He gestured to the device, hidden in the home of a man she had been seeing, a man who called himself a scientist, a man who is now dead. I stared at him, my mind reeling. The device was designed to interface with the electrical impulses of the brain, to map the patterns of memory and thought. In theory, it could record those patterns, preserve them, even alter them. But I had never completed the work. I had stopped when I realized what it could become in the wrong hands, a tool for erasure, for control, for the quiet, invisible destruction of a human soul. "How did you find me?" I whispered. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he handed to me. I took it with trembling fingers and unfolded it. It was a schematic. My schematic. The design I had drafted 2 years ago, before I had hidden all my notes, before I had tried to bury this line of research forever. At the bottom, in my own handwriting, was a single line of text, a signature I had been foolish enough to include. Not my name, but a phrase in Latin, lux ex machina, light from the machine. "I found this in his laboratory," the Duke said, along with correspondence referencing a workshop in Clerkenwell. "It took me 2 weeks to trace you. Another week to confirm that you were the architect of this nightmare." I looked up at him, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of what I had done. Not by intention, not by action, but by creation. I had built something that could reach into the most sacred part of a human being and tear it away. And now a woman lay somewhere in this city, hollowed out, her past erased, herself obliterated. "I never wanted this," I said, and my voice broke. "I swear to you, I never wanted this." He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not forgiveness, not trust, but a kind of terrible recognition, as though he saw in me a reflection of his own helplessness. "I do not care what you wanted," he said quietly. "I care only about what you can do. Can you reverse it? Can you bring her back?" I felt the question like a blade between my ribs. I had asked myself the same thing 1,000 times in the dark hours of the night, during the long months when I had tried to convince myself that the device was only theoretical, that it would never be built, never be used. But I had always known the truth. Once a memory was taken, once the electrical pathways were disrupted, once the self was unwritten, there was no clear path back. The brain was not a ledger that could be corrected with an eraser. It was a living, shifting thing, and what was lost was lost. But I could not tell him that, not yet, not when I saw the desperate, fragile hope buried beneath his cold exterior. "I do not know," I said, "but I will try." He nodded once, a sharp, controlled movement. Then he reached into his coat again and withdrew a small leather purse, which he set on the workbench beside the device. Inside, I knew, there would be money, enough to ensure my cooperation, enough to buy my silence. But when he spoke again, his words were not about payment. "I have another condition," he said. "You will work under my supervision. You will come to Ashcroft House. You will examine Eleanor, and you will do so in secrecy. If word of this reaches the authorities, if anyone learns what this device can do, there will be a panic. Scientists, industrialists, criminals, they will all want it. And they will tear this city apart to possess it. I looked at the device, at the greenish glow still pulsing faintly in its core, and I understood. He was not here only to save his sister. He was here to contain a catastrophe, to keep the world from discovering that the human mind could be rewritten like a line of code in a punch card machine. I will come, I said, but I work alone. I will not be watched like a prisoner. He smiled then, a thin, humorless curve of his lips. You misunderstand, Miss Wren. You are already a prisoner. The only question is whether you will be mine or theirs. He gestured toward the window, and I turned to follow his gaze. Beyond the glass, the city stretched out in a glittering web of electric lights and steam plumes, a vast, churning organism of metal and flesh. Somewhere out there, in the depths of that mechanical sprawl, were men who would kill for what I had built. Men who saw in science not wonder, but power. And now, because of my own brilliance and my own blindness, I had given them a weapon more terrible than any blade. The Duke turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. He paused at the threshold and looked back at me, his face half in shadow. "A carriage will come for you at dawn," he said. "Bring whatever tools you need, and Miss Wren." He hesitated, and for a moment I saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the title. "If you can save her, if you can bring even a fragment of Eleanor back, I will owe you a debt I can never repay. But if you are complicit in what was done to her, if you helped the man who used this device, I will see you hanged." Then he was gone, and I was alone in the dark with the humming of machines and the weight of a choice I had never wanted to make. I looked down at the device on my workbench, at the light pulsing in its heart like the ghost of a stolen soul, and I wondered if there was any difference between saving a life and playing God. I had built a machine to illuminate the mysteries of the mind, to bring light from the machine, but all I had brought into the world was shadow. I extinguished my torch and stood in the blackness, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere out there, a woman lay in a bed she did not recognize, surrounded by faces she could not name, living a life that was no longer hers. And somewhere, buried in the intricate pathways of her ruined mind, might still lie the faintest echo of who she had been. I would find it. I had to. Not because the Duke commanded it, and not because I feared the noose, but because I had built the cage, and now I was the only one who might hold the key. The lights flickered back on at 10 past midnight, bathing the laboratory in cold, electric brilliance. I did not sleep. I gathered my tools, my notebooks, my instruments, and I waited for the dawn. And when the carriage came, black and silent as a hearse, I stepped inside and let it carry me toward Ashcroft House, toward the Duke and his broken sister, toward the terrible truth of what my creation had done. I did not know then that the man who had used my device was not simply dead, but murdered. I did not know that Eleanor's erasure was only the first move in a game far larger and darker than I had imagined. And I did not know that the Duke of Ashcroft, cold and controlled and utterly alone, would become the one person in all the world who understood what it meant to carry a guilt no machine could measure. But I would learn. In the days and nights to come, in the gaslit halls of his ancestral home, in the secret places where science and desperation met, I would learn that some machines cannot be unmade, and some loves cannot be unspoken, and some choices, once made, echo through the electric hum of the world forever. Ashcroft House rose from the morning fog like a monument to old power and new money, its stone facade blackened by decades of coal smoke, its windows glinting with the cold fire of gaslight even in daylight. The carriage that had collected me moved through iron gates wrought in patterns of gears and laurel leaves, past gardens kept with military precision, and stopped before steps wide enough to swallow a regiment. I stepped down onto gravel that crunched beneath my boots, clutching my leather case of instruments, and felt the weight of the place settle over me like a shroud. This was not merely a house. It was a fortress built to keep the world at a distance, and I was about to cross its threshold as both prisoner and savior. The Duke stood waiting at the top of the steps, dressed now in mourning gray, his hands clasped behind his back. In the pale light of morning, I could see him more clearly than I had in the darkness of my laboratory. He was younger than I had imagined, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and a face that would have been handsome had it not been carved into such severe lines. His eyes were the color of winter sky, and when they met mine, I felt the shock of recognition pass between us. We were both people who had built walls around ourselves, who had chosen solitude and work over the messiness of human connection. And now, by cruel necessity, we were bound together. He descended the steps to meet me, and I noticed for the first time the faint scarring on his right hand, visible where his glove did not quite cover his wrist. Burns, perhaps, or the marks of some industrial accident. A man who worked with machines then, not merely owned them. "Miss Wren," he said, and his voice was softer than it had been the night before, though no less controlled. "Thank you for coming. I was not certain you would." "I had little choice," I replied. "You made that clear." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite regret. "Yes, I did." He gestured toward the house. "Come, Eleanor is waiting. Or rather, the woman who was Eleanor is waiting. She does not remember that name or any other." We climbed the steps together, and a servant opened the door before we reached it. A man with white hair and the blank, efficient face of someone trained not to see or hear anything that might inconvenience his employer. Inside, the house was a study in contrasts. The entrance hall was grand in the old style, with marble floors and oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but threaded through it all were the marks of modernity. Electric chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their bulbs enclosed in globes of frosted glass. The walls hummed faintly with the passage of current through hidden conduits. A pneumatic tube system ran along the crown molding, ready to carry messages from room to room with mechanical speed. This was a house caught between centuries, and I wondered if the Duke felt as trapped by it as I suddenly did. He led me through a series of corridors, each more richly appointed than the last, until we reached a door at the far end of the east wing. He paused with his hand on the handle and turned to face me. "Before you see her," he said, "you must understand something. Eleanor was not merely my sister. She was my closest companion, my confidant, the only person in this world I trusted without reservation. We lost our parents young, and we raised each other, in a sense. She was brilliant, curious, fearless. She read philosophy and mechanics. She played the piano with a passion that could move stones to tears. She laughed at things no one else found amusing. She saw through pretense and cruelty with perfect clarity." His voice roughened, and he stopped, composing himself. "The woman in this room has none of that. She is gentle, docile, empty. She responds to simple commands. She smiles when prompted. But there is no light in her eyes, no spark of the self that once burned so fiercely. If you cannot restore that, if all you can do is confirm that she is gone, I need to know. I need to know if I should stop hoping." I met his gaze and saw in it a grief so vast and so carefully contained that it made my chest ache. I had spent years in isolation, surrounded by my machines, convinced that the work was enough, that discovery and creation were all I needed. But looking at this man, at the raw need barely visible beneath his armor, I understood with sudden clarity that there were kinds of loneliness far deeper than mine. "I will do everything I can," I said. "But you must prepare yourself for the possibility that the damage is irreversible. The brain is not a machine that can simply be repaired. Memory is not stored in one place, like a file in a cabinet. It is distributed, woven through the entire structure of the mind. If those connections have been severed, if the pathways have been destroyed, then she may be lost. He nodded once, a sharp, controlled movement, and opened the door. The room beyond was beautiful and terrible. It was decorated in pale blues and creams, with lace curtains that filtered the morning light into something soft and dreamlike. A 4-poster bed stood against one wall, its coverlet embroidered with forget-me-nots. A writing desk sat by the window, its surface empty save for a vase of white roses. And in a chair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing, sat a woman who might have been a ghost. She was perhaps 25, with fair hair, arranged in a simple braid and a face of almost painful delicacy. She wore a dress of pale gray, high-necked and modest, and her posture was perfect, as though she had been arranged by an artist and told not to move. But it was her eyes that struck me most. They were blue, clear, and utterly vacant. She looked at us as we entered, and there was no recognition in her expression. No curiosity, no emotion of any kind. She simply looked and waited, as though she were a clockwork figure waiting to be wound. "Eleanor," the Duke said gently, and the tenderness in his voice was so unexpected that I felt my throat tighten. "This is Miss Wren. She has come to help you." The woman turned her gaze to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in the depths of those empty eyes. But then it was gone, and she smiled, a small, automatic curve of her lips that held no warmth. "How do you do?" she said, and her voice was soft and pleasant, and devoid of any personality whatsoever. I set my case down on the writing desk and opened it, withdrawing the instruments I would need: a stethoscope for listening to her heartbeat, a small electric torch for examining her pupils, a tuning fork for testing her reflexes, and most importantly, a portable version of my resonance detector, a device that could measure the electrical activity of the brain through sensors placed on the scalp. It was crude compared to the equipment in my laboratory, but it would have to suffice. I approached Eleanor slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal, and knelt beside her chair. "May I examine you?" I asked, though I knew she would not refuse. She nodded, still smiling that empty smile, and I began. Her pulse was steady and strong. Her pupils reacted normally to light. Her reflexes were intact. Physically, she was perfectly healthy, a young woman in the prime of life. But when I placed the sensors of my detector against her temples and activated the device, I saw what I had feared. The readings were chaotic, fragmented, a storm of electrical noise where there should have been coherent patterns. It was as though someone had taken a symphony and shattered it into random notes, leaving only discord. I worked in silence for nearly an hour, taking measurements, testing her responses to stimuli, asking her simple questions. "Do you know your name? Do you know where you are? Do you remember anything from before you woke in this room?" To each question, she answered with polite blankness, a courteous admission of ignorance that broke my heart a little more with each repetition. The Duke stood by the window, watching us with the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting for bad news. When I finally removed the sensors and packed away my instruments, he turned to face me. "Well," he said, and the single word carried the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. I glanced at Eleanor, who sat gazing at the fire with the same pleasant, empty expression, and then I gestured for the Duke to follow me into the hallway. He closed the door softly behind us, and we stood in the dim corridor, surrounded by the faint hum of electric current in the walls. "The damage is extensive," I said, keeping my voice low. "Her brain is still active, but the patterns are disrupted. It is as though someone has taken a carefully woven tapestry and pulled out half the threads. What remains is structurally intact, but the image is lost." "Can you restore it?" he asked, and I heard the desperation he was trying so hard to hide. "I do not know," I admitted. "In theory, if I could determine what patterns were erased, I might be able to stimulate the brain to rebuild them. But that would require knowing what was taken, and without a record of her original neural patterns, I am working blind. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. You said the man who did this is dead. How did he die? The Duke's expression hardened. He was found in his laboratory 3 days after Eleanor lost her memory. His throat had been cut, and the place had been ransacked. The authorities believe it was a robbery, that he surprised an intruder and was killed for his trouble. But I do not believe in coincidences. Someone wanted him dead, and they wanted his work destroyed. Or stolen, I said quietly. If he kept records of what he did to Eleanor, if he documented the process, those records would be invaluable. Not just for restoring her, but for replicating the procedure. The Duke stared at me, and I saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed swiftly by horror. You think someone is trying to weaponize this, to turn it into a tool for erasing inconvenient memories, for controlling minds. I think, I said carefully, that what I built was always going to be a weapon. I simply did not want to admit it. And now that it exists, now that it has been used, there will be others who want it. Industrialists who want to erase the memories of workers who have seen too much. Politicians who want to silence enemies without the messiness of murder. Scientists who want to push the boundaries of what the human mind can endure. The device you brought me last night is only a prototype. If someone has access to my designs, they could build more. They could refine the process. They could turn London into a city of ghosts. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold and deadly. Then we must find them before they succeed. And we must find those records, if they still exist. He looked at me, and I saw a resolve in him that matched my own. I am not without resources, Miss Wren. I have access to the man's laboratory. The authorities have finished their investigation, and the building is mine by right of Eleanor's connection to him. If there is anything left to find, we will find it together. I felt a chill run down my spine, not of fear, but of recognition. This was the moment, I realized, when I stopped being merely an inventor hiding in a workshop and became something else. A conspirator, an accomplice, a woman standing at the edge of a precipice about to step into darkness. When do we go? I asked. Tonight, he said. After dark. The laboratory is in Whitechapel, and it is not the sort of place where respectable people are seen during the day. He paused, and I saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the ice. I know I have given you little reason to trust me, Miss Wren. I threatened you. I coerced you. I dragged you into a nightmare not of your making. But I swear to you, if there is a way to set this right, I will find it. Not only for Eleanor, but for you. You did not deserve to have your work perverted into this horror. I looked at him, at the shadows beneath his eyes, at the scars on his hand, at the rigid control that held him together like iron bands around a breaking barrel, and I felt something dangerous stir in my chest. Sympathy, understanding. The beginning of something that might, if I were not careful, become trust. We are both responsible, I said softly. You for failing to protect her, and I for building the knife that cut her. But perhaps, if we work together, we can find a way to undo what has been done. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and then he nodded. Tonight, then. I will send a carriage for you at 9 o'clock. Dress plainly, and bring nothing that might identify you. Where we are going, your name and mine must remain secrets. I agreed, and he led me back through the maze of corridors to the entrance hall. But before I left, I turned back one last time, compelled by an impulse I did not fully understand. Your Grace, I said, and he stopped, his hand on the banister of the grand staircase. In the laboratory last night, you said you would see me hanged if I was complicit in what was done to Eleanor. Do you still believe I am? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw his face soften, just slightly, just enough to reveal the man beneath the title. No, he said. I believe you are a woman who built something beautiful and terrible, and who is now paying the price for her own brilliance. As am I. We are neither of us innocent, Miss Wren, but perhaps we are not beyond redemption." Then he climbed the stairs and disappeared into the upper reaches of the house, leaving me alone in the echoing hall with the hum of electric lights and the distant ticking of clockwork mechanisms hidden in the walls. I walked out into the cold morning air, and the carriage carried me back to my workshop in Clerkenwell. But I could not stop thinking about the empty woman in the pale blue room, or the broken man who loved her, or the darkness we were about to walk into together. I spent the day preparing. I cleaned my tools, sharpened my pencils, packed a small bag with the essentials I might need for examining the dead man's laboratory. I ate sparingly, mechanically, tasting nothing. I watched the sun move across the sky, casting long shadows through my workshop, and I thought about the nature of memory. What makes us who we are? Whether the self can survive the erasure of the past? Whether love can endure when the beloved no longer remembers your face? At 9 o'clock precisely, the carriage arrived. It was unmarked, drawn by black horses, and the driver wore no livery. I climbed inside and found the Duke already waiting, dressed in dark clothing that made him nearly invisible in the dim interior. He nodded to me, but did not speak, and we rode in silence through the gaslit streets, leaving behind the elegance of Mayfair and Kensington, and descending into the grimy, industrial heart of the city. Whitechapel was a place of narrow alleys and crumbling brick, of factories belching steam into the night sky, and tenements packed with the desperate and the dispossessed. The streets smelled of coal smoke and rotting vegetables and human misery. We stopped before a building that might once have been a warehouse, its windows boarded over, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. The Duke stepped down first and offered me his hand, and I took it, feeling the strength in his grip, the heat of his skin through the thin leather of our gloves. "This is the place," he said quietly. "Stay close to me. And if anything seems wrong, if you sense any danger, we leave immediately. Do you understand?" I nodded, and together we entered the dead man's laboratory, stepping into a darkness that smelled of old blood and stranger things, into a place where science and murder had met and left their marks, into the next chapter of a mystery that would bind us together in ways neither of us could yet imagine. The door closed behind us with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut, and I heard, in the silence that followed, the distant rhythm of my own heart and the faint, electric hum of machinery that should not still be running in an abandoned place. The laboratory was a cathedral of abandoned ambition. The Duke struck a match, and the flame revealed a space far larger than I had anticipated, a vast chamber that stretched back into shadows our small light could not penetrate. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces cluttered with apparatus I recognized, and some I did not. Glass beakers filled with liquid that had long since evaporated to sticky residue. Copper coils twisted into Baroque spirals. A generator squatting in the corner like a mechanical toad, its flywheel still and silent. But it was the sound that caught my attention, that faint electric hum I had heard from outside. Something in this place was still alive. The Duke moved forward with the caution of a man expecting violence, and I followed, my hand instinctively reaching for the small voltage tester in my pocket. We passed beneath an arch of iron pipes, and the space opened into what must have been the main working area. Here, the evidence of destruction was unmistakable. Tables overturned, their contents spilled across the floor in a chaos of broken glass and scattered papers. Cabinets torn open, their drawers hanging like broken teeth. And on the far wall, a massive chalkboard covered in equations, half of them smeared away by a hand or cloth dragged across the surface in haste or rage. "He tried to hide something," the Duke said quietly, gesturing to the board, "or someone else did, after they killed him." I approached the chalkboard, holding up the small electric torch the Duke handed me, and studied what remained of the writing. The equations were complex, dealing with electromagnetic fields and neural resonance, but they were not mine. This man, whoever he had been, had taken my work and extended it, refined it, pushed it into territories I had never dared explore. There were calculations here for sustained neural disruption, for targeted memory erasure, for something the writer had labeled selective consciousness fragmentation. And at the bottom, barely visible beneath the smearing, was a symbol I did not recognize. A circle bisected by a lightning bolt, with the letters C and P intertwined at its center. "Do you know what this means?" I asked, tracing the symbol with my finger. The Duke leaned closer, and I felt the warmth of him at my shoulder, smelled the faint scent of wool and soap and something darker, like gun oil. "No," he said, "but I intend to find out." He straightened and moved to one of the intact cabinets, pulling open drawers and sorting through their contents with methodical precision. His movements were efficient, practiced, and I realized he had done this before. Searched through the wreckage of someone else's life, looking for answers. I turned my attention to the workbench nearest the chalkboard. Beneath the broken glassware and scattered tools, I found a leather-bound journal, its cover stained with something that might have been wine, or might have been blood. I opened it carefully, and the pages crackled with age and damp. The handwriting inside was cramped and frantic, the words tumbling over each other in a rush to be recorded. "The subject continues to respond well to treatment," one entry read. "Memory suppression achieved at 78% efficacy. Minor personality drift observed, but within acceptable parameters. The client is pleased. Payment received in full. Next subject scheduled for the 15th. My blood ran cold. Next subject. This had not been an isolated incident, an experiment gone wrong. This had been a business, a service offered to those with money and a need to make inconvenient memories disappear. "Your Grace?" I said, and my voice was steady despite the horror rising in my throat. "You need to see this." He crossed to me in 3 strides and took the journal from my hands, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing fury. When he looked up, his face was no longer composed. It was a mask of barely contained rage. He was erasing people for hire, he said, and each word was sharp as broken glass, selling their minds to the highest bidder. How many? How many did he destroy before Eleanor? I turned the pages, counting entries, and felt my stomach twist. "At least a dozen," I said. "Possibly more. The earlier entries are missing, either torn out or never recorded." The Duke slammed the journal shut with enough force to make me flinch, and then he stood very still, his head bowed, his hands clenched around the leather cover. I watched the tendons stand out in his wrists, watched him struggle to master the violence that wanted to break free, and I understood that he was a man capable of terrible things when pushed. Perhaps he had already done terrible things. Perhaps that was why he recognized a weapon when he saw one. "We need to find the records," he said finally, his voice rough. "The names of his clients, the details of what was done. If we can identify the victims, we might be able to reverse the process, or at least stop it from happening again." "And the symbol," I added, "the circle and the lightning bolt. That means something. It is too deliberate to be random." We searched for another hour, sorting through the wreckage, piecing together fragments of a picture that grew darker with each discovery. There were ledgers hidden in a false bottom drawer, listing payments in amounts that made my head spin. There were photographs of men and women, their faces blank and placid, each marked with a date and a number. There were notes on technique, on improvements to the device, on ways to make the erasure more complete, more permanent, more profitable. And threaded through it all, appearing again and again in the margins and corners of pages, was that same symbol, the circle and the lightning bolt, C and P. It was the Duke who found the final piece. He had been examining the generator in the corner, the one that should have been dead but was still emitting that faint electric hum. He knelt beside it, running his hands over the casing, and then he found the hidden panel. It sprang open at his touch, revealing a compartment built into the machine's interior. Inside was a small metal box, sealed with a lock that looked more ceremonial than secure. He brought it to the workbench, and I watched as he produced a thin pick from his pocket and worked the lock with the ease of someone who had learned the skill young and never forgotten it. The box opened with a soft click, and inside, nestled in velvet, was a sheaf of papers and a small glass vial filled with a luminous green liquid that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The Duke lifted the vial carefully, holding it up to the torchlight, and I saw the liquid swirl and pulse as though it were alive. "What is this?" he asked, and I heard the unease in his voice. I took the vial from him and examined it closely. The liquid inside was not uniform. It had a granular quality, as though it were a suspension of microscopic particles in solution. When I tilted it, the particles moved in patterns that were almost deliberate, almost intentional, clustering and dispersing in ways that defied simple physics. "I think," I said slowly, "this is a neural catalyst, a substance designed to enhance the conductivity of the brain's electrical signals. If introduced into the body, it could make the mind more susceptible to external manipulation. It could lower the barriers between thought and action, between memory and erasure. It could be the key to making the device work more efficiently." "Or more permanently," the Duke said, and his voice was hollow. I set the vial down with great care and turned my attention to the papers. They were correspondence, written in a hand that was elegant and precise, the letters formed with the care of someone who valued appearances. The signature at the bottom of each was different, but the tone was always the same. Formal, businesslike, utterly devoid of conscience. One letter in particular caught my eye. It was dated 3 weeks before Eleanor lost her memory, and it was addressed to the dead man by a name I did not recognize. "Mr. Hargrave," it began, "we are prepared to move forward with the demonstration. The subject you have selected will serve admirably. Ensure the process is clean, complete, and documented. Our investors are eager to see proof of concept before committing further capital. Upon successful completion, you will receive the agreed sum and an invitation to join the Prometheus Collective in full standing. Fail, and the consequences will be severe." The letter was unsigned, but at the bottom, embossed in gold ink, was the symbol, the circle and the lightning bolt, C&P Prometheus Collective. I felt the pieces fall into place with sickening clarity. This was not the work of one man. It was an organization, a group of individuals with money and ambition and a complete lack of moral restraint. They had funded Hargrave's research, they had encouraged him to refine the device, and they had demanded a demonstration. Eleanor had not been a random victim. She had been chosen, selected as proof that the technology worked, that the human mind could be erased and remade to order. "They used her as an experiment," I whispered, "a test case, to show their investors what the device could do." The Duke took the letter from my hands and read it, and I watched the color drain from his face. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer cold. They were burning, incandescent with a fury so intense it was almost frightening. "I will find them," he said, and his voice was soft and deadly. "I will find every member of this collective, every investor, every accomplice, and I will destroy them. I will burn their names from history. I will see them ruined, imprisoned, or dead. I swear it. I believed him." In that moment, standing in the ruins of a dead man's ambition, surrounded by the evidence of atrocities committed in the name of progress, I believed that the Duke of Ashcroft was capable of anything. And I realized, with a shock that went through me like electric current, that I wanted to help him. Not because I owed him, and not because I feared him, but because the anger I saw in his eyes was a mirror of my own. "We need to be careful," I said. "If this collective is as powerful as these letters suggest, they will have resources we cannot match, money, influence, connections. If they learn we are investigating them, they will come for us." "Let them come," he said. "I have faced worse enemies than men who hide behind symbols and unsigned letters." He folded the correspondence carefully and slipped it into his coat. "We will take this evidence to someone I trust, a man who has the power to act without drawing attention. And then we will set a trap. For the collective, I asked. For whoever comes next, he replied. Because they will come. Hargrave is dead, but his work is not. And if someone killed him to take his research, they will eventually realize that the device in my possession is incomplete. They will realize that the true architect of the technology is still alive. And they will come for you, Miss Wren. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I had known, on some level, that I was in danger from the moment the Duke appeared in my laboratory. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the certainty in his voice, made it real in a way it had not been before. Then we use that, I said. We let them come. And when they do, we learn who they are and what they want. I met his gaze, and I saw surprise flicker in his eyes, followed by something that might have been respect. I am not afraid of them, Your Grace. I am afraid of what will happen if we do nothing. How many more people will lose themselves? How many more minds will be erased? I built the weapon. I have a responsibility to unmake it, or at least to ensure it is never used again. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. You are not what I expected, Miss Wren. Neither are you, I replied. Something shifted in the air between us, a subtle realignment, and I realized we were no longer merely allies of necessity. We were partners, bound by a shared purpose and a shared guilt, and perhaps, though I did not want to name it, by something more dangerous still. The beginning of understanding, the beginning of trust, the beginning of a connection that went beyond logic or reason into the territory of the heart. The Duke turned away first, breaking the moment, and began gathering the evidence we had found. I helped him in silence, packing the journal and letters into my bag, wrapping the vial of luminous liquid in cloth so it would not break. When we were done, we stood together in the center of the ruined laboratory, surrounded by the ghosts of Hargrave's victims, and I felt the weight of what we had discovered settle over me like armor. We should go, the Duke said. It is past midnight. If anyone sees us leaving, there will be questions. Agreed, I said. But there is one more thing I need to do first. I walked to the generator in the corner, the one that was still humming with inexplicable life, and I examined it closely. The hum was coming from within, from the hidden compartment where the metal box had been stored. I reached inside and felt along the walls until my fingers found what I was looking for. A secondary power source, a battery of some kind, small and compact, but incredibly efficient. It was feeding current into the generator, keeping it alive, and connected to it was a wire that ran up through the ceiling into the building above. This is a signal, I said, or a trigger. Someone has been monitoring this place, waiting for someone to find the hidden compartment, waiting for us. The Duke was beside me in an instant, his face tense. Can you disable it? I can try, I said. But if I cut the wire, whoever is listening will know we were here. They will know we found the box. Then let them know, he said grimly. Let them know we are not afraid. Let them know we are coming for them. I took my wire cutters from my bag and severed the connection with a single, decisive cut. The hum stopped instantly, and the silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, as though the building itself were holding its breath. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And then, from somewhere far above us, I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving with purpose, coming toward the stairs that led down into the laboratory. We need to leave, the Duke said, his voice urgent. Now. He grabbed my hand and we ran. Through the laboratory, past the overturned tables and broken equipment, toward the door we had entered through. But as we reached it, I heard the sound of boots on the steps outside, descending rapidly, blocking our exit. We were trapped. The Duke pulled me back into the shadows, his arm around my waist, his body shielding mine. I felt his heart beating against my back, fast and strong, and I realized with sudden, shocking clarity that I was not afraid, not of the men coming to find us, and not of the danger we were in. I was exhilarated. For the first time in years, I felt truly, completely alive. "There is another way out," I whispered. "The generator. It has a vent for exhaust. If we can reach it, we can follow the pipe up to the roof." He looked at me, and even in the darkness, I could see the question in his eyes. "You are certain?" "No," I admitted, "but it is our only chance." "Then we go," he said, and we moved together through the shadows, two figures fleeing through the dark heart of a dead man's laboratory, pursued by enemies we could not yet see, but could no longer ignore. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing off the walls, and I heard voices now, low and urgent, speaking words I could not quite make out. We reached the generator just as the door burst open and light flooded the space, harsh and blinding, revealing our absence in the place where they expected to find us. The Duke pulled open the vent cover, and I crawled inside without hesitation, feeling my way up the narrow metal tube, my hands and knees scraping against the sides, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The Duke followed close behind, his bulk barely fitting in the confined space, and I heard him curse softly as he pulled the cover shut behind us. Below, the voices grew louder, more frantic, and I heard the sound of furniture being overturned, of a systematic search beginning. We climbed in darkness and silence, our lungs burning, our muscles screaming, until finally I saw a square of lesser darkness above us. The roof. I pushed against the grate with all my strength, and it gave way with a squeal of rusted metal, and then we were out, gasping in the cold night air, standing on the slanted roof of a building in Whitechapel, with the lights of London spread out below us like a sea of stars. The Duke helped me to my feet, and for a moment, we stood there, breathing hard, staring at each other. His face was smudged with soot, his coat torn at the shoulder, and his hair had come loose from its careful arrangement. He looked wild, dangerous, and utterly magnificent, and I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that I had never met anyone like him, and that I never would again. "We need to move," he said, but his voice was soft, almost gentle, "before they realize we're gone." I nodded, and we made our way across the rooftops, leaping from building to building with a recklessness born of necessity, until we reached a fire escape that led down into an alley blocks away from Hargrave's laboratory. The carriage was waiting where we had left it, the driver impassive and unquestioning, and we climbed inside and let the wheels carry us away from danger, away from the men who hunted us, away from the darkness we had uncovered. But I knew, as the Duke sat across from me in the swaying carriage, his eyes never leaving my face, that we were not running away. We were running toward something, toward the Prometheus Collective and the truth of what they had done, toward justice for Eleanor and all the nameless victims whose minds had been erased for profit, and toward each other, drawn together by a bond forged in guilt and tempered in fire, a connection neither of us had asked for, but neither of us could now deny. We did not return to Ashcroft House that night. The Duke brought me instead to a place I had not known existed. A townhouse in Bloomsbury that he kept under a name not his own, a refuge for emergencies and secrets. The rooms were furnished simply but well, with gaslight fixtures that cast warm shadows on papered walls and a small laboratory in the back that made my heart ache with recognition. Someone had known what I would need. Someone had prepared this place with care. He left me there with a promise to return at first light, and I spent the dark hours examining the vial of luminous liquid we had stolen from Hargrave's laboratory, running tests with the limited equipment available, trying to understand what I was seeing. The substance was extraordinary. Under magnification, I could see that the particles suspended in the solution were not random debris, but precisely engineered structures, microscopic machines of crystal and metal that moved with purpose, that responded to electrical current by arranging themselves into intricate patterns. Whoever had created this had gone far beyond anything I had achieved. They had built a bridge between the mechanical and the biological, between the electric pulse of a machine and the electric pulse of a living mind. By dawn, I had filled 3 pages with observations and theories, and I was no closer to understanding how to reverse what had been done to Eleanor. The neural catalyst would make her mind more receptive to the device, yes, but it would also make any attempt at restoration more dangerous. One wrong impulse, one miscalculation, and I could erase what little remained of her. I could turn her into something less than human, a body without a soul, a machine without a ghost. The Duke arrived as the sun broke over the rooftops, bringing with him fresh clothes for me, a breakfast I barely touched, and news that made my blood run cold. There had been another incident. A young woman, the daughter of a shipping magnate, had woken that morning with no memory of her life, no recognition of her family, nothing but a blank and pleasant smile. The physicians were baffled. The family was devastated. And on the girl's nightstand, barely visible beneath a vase of flowers, someone had found a calling card embossed with a circle and a lightning bolt. "They are making a statement," the Duke said, his voice tight with fury, "showing us they can strike at will, that no one is safe." He paced the small sitting room like a caged wolf, his hands clenched behind his back. "I have sent word to the family, offered my assistance, but they do not know me. They do not trust me. And I cannot tell them the truth without revealing what was done to Eleanor, without exposing her to scandal and pity." I set down my teacup and rose to face him. "Then we must stop them before they do this again. We must find a way to identify the members of the collective, to track them, to bring them to justice." "Justice," he said bitterly. "What justice is there in this world for men with money and power? The authorities will not believe us. They will call us mad, or worse, accomplices. And even if we had proof, even if we could name every member of the collective, do you truly believe they would be punished? Men like that do not face consequences. They buy their way out, or they disappear, or they simply wait until the scandal passes and emerge unscathed." I heard the despair beneath his anger, the exhaustion of a man who had fought too many battles and lost too many times. I crossed to him and placed my hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, the barely controlled violence that wanted an outlet. "Then we do not seek justice through the courts," I said quietly. "We destroy the technology. We make it impossible for them to use the device again. And we give Eleanor and the others a chance to reclaim what was stolen from them." He looked down at me, and I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of hope, fragile and dangerous. "You think you can do that? You think you can restore them?" "I do not know," I admitted. "But I have an idea. The neural catalyst in that vial, it is designed to make the mind malleable, to lower its defenses against external manipulation. But if I could reverse its properties, if I could create a compound that strengthens those defenses instead of weakening them, it might be possible to stimulate the brain to rebuild the pathways that were destroyed. It would not restore the original memories, not perfectly, but it might allow new ones to form, might allow the self to reassemble from fragments. "It is a desperate plan," he said. "It is the only plan we have," I replied. He held my gaze for a moment longer, and then he nodded. "What do you need?" "Time," I said. "Access to better equipment than what I have here, and a test subject willing to take the risk." "Eleanor," he said, and it was not a question. "If she consents," I said carefully. "If she understands what I am proposing and chooses to proceed. I will not force this upon her. I will not become what Hargrave was." The Duke smiled then, a small, sad curve of his lips. "You could never be what he was, Miss Wren. You care too much. It is both your strength and your weakness." We returned to Ashcroft House that afternoon, and I set up my equipment in a room adjacent to Eleanor's, a small parlor that the Duke ordered cleared of furniture and filled instead with the apparatus I required. My assistants, 2 young men the Duke trusted implicitly, helped me install the resonance detector, the electrical stimulation array, and a dozen other devices whose purpose I explained in terms too technical for them to understand, but which they assembled with quiet competence. By evening, the room looked like a cross between a surgery and an inventor's fever dream, all brass and glass and humming wire. Eleanor sat in the chair we had prepared for her hands folded in her lap, her expression as placid and empty as ever. I knelt before her and took her hands in mine, feeling the delicate bones beneath her soft skin, and I tried to find words that would reach whatever remained of her. "Eleanor," I said gently, "I am going to try something that might help you remember who you were. It will not hurt, but it may be uncomfortable, and there is a risk. If something goes wrong, you could be harmed. Do you understand?" She looked at me with those clear, vacant eyes, and for a moment I thought she would simply nod and smile as she always did. But then something flickered in her expression, something that might have been fear or might have been hope. "Will I know him again?" she asked, and her voice was so soft I almost missed the words. "The man who watches me, the one who cries when he thinks I cannot see." My throat tightened, and I glanced at the Duke, who stood by the window, his back to us, his shoulders rigid. He had not heard her, or perhaps he had, and could not bear to turn around. "Yes," I said, though I did not know if it was true. "If this works, you will remember him. You will remember everything." "Then do it," she said. And there was a note of certainty in her voice that had not been there before, a fragment of the woman she had been breaking through the fog. "Please, I am so tired of being empty." I squeezed her hands once and then rose, moving to the control panel I had constructed. The Duke turned from the window and came to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the tension radiating from his body like electricity. "Are you ready?" I asked him. "No," he said, "but we have no choice." I activated the device and the room filled with a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones. The sensors attached to Eleanor's temples began to glow with pale blue light, and I watched the readings on my instruments, monitoring the electrical activity of her brain as I gradually increased the stimulation. Her eyes closed and her breathing deepened, and I saw her fingers begin to twitch, small, involuntary movements that suggested her nervous system was responding. I had prepared the counter-catalyst the night before, working from the formula I had deduced by analyzing Hargrave's compound. It was a mixture of organic compounds and metallic salts, suspended in a solution that would allow it to pass through the blood-brain barrier and interact with the microscopic machines already present in her system. In theory, it would reprogram those machines, turn them from instruments of destruction into instruments of healing. In theory. I drew the solution into a syringe and approached Eleanor, and the Duke stepped forward as if to stop me. But he did not. He simply stood there, watching, his face pale and his jaw clenched, and I knew he was praying to a god he probably did not believe in. I injected the compound into the vein at Eleanor's wrist, and then I returned to the control panel and increased the stimulation to the precise frequency I had calculated. For a moment, nothing happened. And then Eleanor gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and her eyes flew open, wide and staring. The readings on my instruments spiked, a sudden surge of activity that made my heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. Her lips moved, forming words I could not hear over the hum of the machinery. I reduced the stimulation gradually, carefully, watching her face for signs of distress. And then, as the hum faded to silence and the blue light dimmed, she spoke. "Tom," she whispered, and her voice was different now, rougher, more real. "Tom, where are you?" The Duke was across the room in an instant, kneeling before her, taking her face in his hands. "I am here, Eleanor. I am here. Do you know me? Do you remember?" Tears began to stream down her cheeks, and she reached up to touch his face with trembling fingers. "I remember fragments," she said. "Pieces, your face, your voice. The library where we used to read together. The night Mama died, and you held me until I stopped crying. But there are holes, Tom. So many holes. It is like looking at a tapestry with half the threads pulled out. It is enough, he said, and his voice broke. It is more than enough. We will fill the holes together. We will rebuild what was taken. I watched them, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, something painful and beautiful and utterly unexpected. This was what I had been missing all the years I spent alone in my laboratory, surrounded by machines that could not love or grieve or hope. This was what it meant to be human, to care so deeply that the pain of it was inseparable from the joy. I turned away to give them privacy, and I began to shut down the equipment, my hands moving mechanically through the familiar motions. But I could not stop the tears that blurred my vision, could not stop the trembling that seized my body now that the crisis had passed. I had done it. I had given Eleanor back a part of herself. It was not complete, not perfect, but it was real. And it was more than I had dared to hope. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find the Duke standing behind me, his eyes red, but his expression transformed. He looked younger, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted from him. "You saved her," he said simply. "You gave her back to me." "I gave her back to herself," I corrected gently. "The rest is up to her." He smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I had seen from him, and it took my breath away. "Then let me give you something in return." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which he handed to me. I opened it and found a list of names, a dozen or more, written in a careful hand. "These are the members of the Prometheus Collective," he said, "or at least the ones I have been able to identify. I have spent the last 2 days calling in favors, making threats, bribing informants. It is not complete, but it is a start." I stared at the names, some of which I recognized: industrialists, politicians, even a bishop, men of wealth and influence, pillars of society, and every one of them complicit in the erasure of human souls for profit. "What do we do with this?" I asked. "We use it," he said. "We go to each one, and we give them a choice. Confess their involvement, destroy their copies of the device, and face justice on our terms. Or refuse and watch as I destroy them piece by piece, their reputations, their fortunes, their families. I will burn their lives to ash." There was a coldness in his voice that should have frightened me, but instead, I felt only a fierce satisfaction. These men deserved no mercy. They had shown none to their victims. "And if they come for us first," I said, "if they try to silence us, then we fight," he replied, "together." He held out his hand, and I took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. We stood there in the makeshift laboratory, surrounded by the hum of cooling equipment and the soft sound of Eleanor weeping with relief in the next room. And I knew that something had changed between us. We were no longer merely allies, no longer bound only by necessity and guilt. We had become something more, partners in truth, conspirators against injustice, and perhaps, though neither of us dared to speak it aloud, something that might one day be called love. But there was no time for such thoughts. Even as we stood there, the door to the house burst open below, and I heard the sound of heavy boots on marble, of voices raised in command. The Duke released my hand and moved to the window, looking down into the courtyard, and I saw his face harden. "They are here," he said, "at least a dozen men, armed." He turned to me, and I saw in his eyes a resolve that matched my own. "We need to get Eleanor to safety, and then we need to finish this." I gathered my most essential equipment, the notes and formulas I could not afford to lose, and the Duke called for his most trusted servants. Within minutes, Eleanor was being spirited away through a hidden passage that led to the stables, accompanied by 2 footmen who would take her to a safe house in the country. And then it was just the 2 of us, standing in the entrance hall as the men outside began to batter at the doors. The Duke opened a cabinet and withdrew 2 revolvers, checking their chambers with practiced ease. He handed one to me, and I took it, feeling the weight of it, the cold reality of metal and death. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. "I am an inventor," I said. "I know how everything works." He laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. "Then let us hope it does not come to that." The doors burst open, and the men poured in, a tide of dark coats and hard faces. But they stopped when they saw us standing there, armed and unafraid, and I saw confusion flicker across their features. "The Duke of Ashcroft," one of them said, and I recognized him from the photographs we had found in Hargrave's laboratory. "A man named Cornelius, a shipping magnate, one of the names on our list. Stand aside. We have business with the woman." "You have no business here," the Duke said coldly. "Leave now, and I will not have you arrested for breaking and entering." Cornelius smiled, a thin, ugly expression. "You misunderstand your position, Your Grace. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to retrieve what belongs to us. The device, the formulas, and the woman who built them." "Over my dead body," the Duke said, and he raised the revolver. "That," Cornelius said, "can be arranged." And then the world exploded into violence and noise, and I found myself firing the gun in my hand, feeling the kick of it against my palm, watching as one of the men fell clutching his shoulder. The Duke moved beside me with deadly precision, his shots finding their marks, driving the intruders back toward the door. But there were too many of them, and I knew we could not hold them off forever. Then I heard a sound that made my heart leap with sudden, desperate hope. The wail of police whistles growing louder, converging on the house from all directions. The Duke had not been idle during the days I spent analyzing the neural catalyst. He had been preparing, laying traps, calling in the few allies he trusted. And now they had arrived, drawn by the sound of gunfire, ready to end this. Cornelius heard them too, and his face twisted with rage. "This is not over," he snarled. "The collective will not forgive this." "Then let them come," I said, stepping forward. "Let them come and see what happens to men who try to play God with human minds." He stared at me, and I saw in his eyes the recognition that he had underestimated me, that he had thought me weak because I was a woman, because I worked in shadows, because I had tried to hide my creation from the world. But I was not weak. I was the architect of his weapon, and I was the only one who could unmake it. The police burst through the door, and the men scattered, some fleeing, some surrendering, some fighting until they were beaten down and shackled. Cornelius himself was taken away in chains, still shouting threats and promises of vengeance, and I watched him go with a cold satisfaction that surprised me. It was over. Or at least, this part of it was over. There would be trials, investigations, revelations that would shake London society to its foundations. But the Prometheus Collective was broken, its members exposed, its terrible work brought into the light. And Eleanor, somewhere in the countryside, was beginning to remember who she had been. The Duke and I stood together in the ruined entrance hall, surrounded by shattered glass and splintered wood, and he turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. Gratitude and admiration and something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken. "You did not have to stay," he said. "You could have run when you had the chance." "Where would I go?" I replied. "You are the only person in the world who understands what I have done, what I have built, what I have destroyed." "Then stay," he said, and his voice was low and urgent. "Stay with me. Help me rebuild what the collective has broken. Not just Eleanor, but all of them. Every victim, every stolen mind. We can do this together." I looked at him, at the soot on his face and the blood on his shirt, at the exhaustion and determination in his eyes, and I knew that I had already made my choice. Not in that moment, but somewhere in the darkness of Hargrave's laboratory, or perhaps even earlier, the night he first appeared in my workshop holding the device I had tried so hard to hide. "Yes," I said, "I will stay." The trials lasted 3 months, and by the time they concluded, winter had settled over London like a shroud of ice and steam. I attended every session, sitting in the gallery beside the Duke, watching as the members of the Prometheus Collective were brought before judges and juries, their crimes laid bare for all the world to see. Some confessed, broken by the weight of evidence and the threat of worse revelations. Others maintained their innocence to the end, even as witnesses testified to payments made, devices commissioned, minds destroyed for profit. Cornelius himself was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and I felt no satisfaction in it, only a hollow acknowledgement that justice, such as it was, had been served. But the trials were not the true work. The true work happened in the quiet hours. In the laboratory I had established in the west wing of Ashcroft House, where I spent my days analyzing the neural patterns of Hargrave's victims and my nights developing treatments tailored to each individual case. Some responded well to the counter-catalyst, regaining fragments of memory, glimpses of the people they had been. Others showed no improvement at all, their minds too damaged, the erasure too complete. And with each failure, I felt the weight of my creation settle more heavily on my shoulders. Eleanor became my partner in this endeavor. As her own memories returned, slowly and imperfectly, she insisted on helping me, on using her experience to guide the treatment of others. She was gentle with the victims, patient in ways I could not be, and she had an intuition for the work that surpassed my technical knowledge. She understood, as I never could, what it meant to wake in a world where nothing made sense, where the faces of loved ones were those of strangers, where the self was a hollow shell waiting to be filled. The Duke, for his part, became our shield and our advocate. He used his wealth and influence to track down victims, to bring them to us for treatment, to ensure that the authorities did not shut down our work before it was complete. He established a fund for those who had lost employment or position due to their erasures, and he spoke in Parliament, demanding reforms that would prevent such abuses in the future. He was tireless, driven by a guilt that matched my own, and by a determination that nothing like the Prometheus Collective would ever rise again. And in the quiet moments between the work, in the evenings when the laboratory fell silent and Eleanor retired to her rooms, he and I found ourselves drawn together. At first, it was only to discuss the cases, to share our frustrations and our small victories. But gradually, the conversations deepened, moving beyond the technical into the personal. He told me about his childhood, about the loneliness of being raised as heir to a title he had never wanted, about the loss of his parents and the weight of responsibility that had shaped him into the cold, controlled man the world saw. I told him about my own isolation, about the years I had spent building machines because they were safer than people, because they could not disappoint or abandon or betray. We were alike, the two of us, both hiding behind walls we had built to keep the world at bay, both afraid to reach for connection lest it be torn away. But the walls were crumbling now, worn down by proximity and shared purpose and something neither of us dared to name. It was on a night in late February when snow fell outside the windows and the city glowed with the amber light of gas lamps reflected off ice, that everything changed. I had been working late, adjusting the calibration on a new version of the resonance detector, when I heard footsteps in the hall. I turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, his coat dusted with snow, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You should be resting," I said. "You have been at Parliament all day." "I could say the same to you," he replied. "You have not left this room since morning. I cannot rest," I admitted. "Not when there is so much still to do. Not when there are still people out there whose minds have been stolen, who are waiting for someone to help them." He crossed to where I stood and placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You cannot save them all," he said gently. "You cannot carry this burden alone." "I am not alone," I whispered. "I have you." The words hung in the air between us, and I saw his expression shift, the careful control slipping away to reveal something raw and vulnerable beneath. He raised one hand to my face, his thumb brushing across my cheek, and I realized I was crying, tears I had not allowed myself to shed for months, finally breaking free. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said, his voice rough. "You are brilliant and brave and utterly infuriating in your refusal to accept defeat. You have given me back my sister. You have given purpose to my guilt. And I do not know how to tell you what that means to me without sounding like a fool." "Then do not tell me," I said, and I reached up to cover his hand with mine. "Show me." He kissed me then, and it was not the practiced kiss of a man accustomed to seduction, but something hesitant and searching, as though he were asking a question he did not know how to voice. I answered by pulling him closer, by letting go of the control I had maintained for so long, by allowing myself to feel the full weight of what I had been denying. I loved him, not because he had rescued me, and not because he needed me, but because he understood me, because he had seen the worst of what I had done and had not turned away, because he carried his own darkness with the same quiet determination I carried mine. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, he rested his forehead against mine and smiled, a real smile, unguarded and beautiful. "I have wanted to do that since the night I found you in your laboratory," he admitted. "Standing there in the darkness, unafraid of me, challenging me. I thought then that you were either the bravest person I had ever met or the most reckless. I still have not decided which." "Perhaps I am both," I said. "Perhaps that is why I love you," he replied, and the words were so simple, so direct, that they took my breath away. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, I heard a sound from the hallway. Footsteps, light and quick, and then Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with excitement. "Tom," she said, breathless. "Miss Wren, you must come." One of the patients, the girl from Mayfair, she just spoke her name. Her real name, she remembered. We followed her through the house to the rooms we had set aside for the victims undergoing treatment. And there, sitting up in bed, was a young woman I had been treating for 6 weeks without success. Her name was Catherine, or at least that was what we had called her, a placeholder for the identity she had lost. But now she looked at us with clear eyes, and she said, in a voice trembling with emotion, "My name is Lydia Ashford. I am 18 years old. I live in Mayfair with my parents, and I remember." The Duke and I exchanged a glance, and I saw in his eyes the same fierce joy I felt. It was working. The treatments were working, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. We were bringing them back. Over the following weeks, more patients began to recover. Not all of them, and not completely, but enough to give us hope. Enough to prove that what Hargrave and the collective had done was not irreversible. The mind, it seemed, was more resilient than any machine, more capable of healing than I had dared to imagine. And with each recovery, I felt the guilt that had haunted me begin to ease, not disappearing, but transforming into something I could live with, a reminder of what I had learned, a promise to do better. Eleanor's memories continued to return in fits and starts, fragments assembling into a picture that would never be complete, but was recognizably hers. She remembered her childhood, her parents, the years she had spent with Tom. She remembered falling in love with Hargrave, believing his promises, trusting him with secrets she should have kept. And she remembered the night he had used the device on her, the moment when everything she was had been torn away, leaving only emptiness. But she no longer dwelt in that emptiness. She had built something new from the pieces, a self that was both the woman she had been and the woman she had become. One evening, as spring began to soften the edges of winter, she found me in the laboratory and sat beside me, watching as I made notes on a new treatment protocol. "You love him," she said, and it was not a question. I set down my pen and met her gaze. "Yes," I admitted, "I do." She smiled, and it was the smile of the woman she had been, full of warmth and mischief. Good. He needs someone who sees him as he is, not as the world demands him to be. Someone who will not let him hide behind duty and titles. She paused, and her expression grew serious. I blamed him, when I first started to remember. I was angry that he had not protected me, that he had let Hargrave into my life. But that was unfair. I made my own choices. I trusted the wrong man. And Tom has spent every day since trying to make amends for something that was never his fault. He blames himself for everything, I said quietly. For your erasure. For not seeing the danger. For all the others who suffered because the technology existed. Then you must help him see that blame is not the same as responsibility, Eleanor said. We are responsible for what we do with the knowledge we have, yes. But we are not to blame for the evil that others choose to commit. She reached out and took my hand. You built something that could have changed the world for the better. It was stolen and perverted. That is not your sin to carry. Her words stayed with me long after she left, and I thought about them as I continued my work, as I treated patient after patient, as I watched the Duke exhaust himself in pursuit of justice. And I realized she was right. I could not undo what had been done. I could not unmake the device or erase the knowledge I had brought into the world. But I could choose how to use it. I could choose to heal rather than harm, to illuminate rather than destroy. I could choose to be more than the sum of my mistakes. It was on a night in April, when the city was blooming with the first green of spring and the air smelled of rain and new growth, that the Duke asked me to marry him. We were walking in the gardens of Ashcroft House, under trees strung with electric lights that glowed like captured stars, and he stopped beside a fountain where water cascaded over stone in an endless musical cycle. I know I am not an easy man to love, he said, taking my hands in his. I am too controlled, too burdened by the past, too accustomed to solitude. But you have taught me that walls can be torn down, that guilt can be transformed into purpose, that love is not a weakness, but a strength. And I do not want to live without you. I do not want to face the world without knowing you are beside me. So I am asking, not as a duke, but as a man who has found in you everything he did not know he needed. Will you marry me? I looked at him, at the hope and fear mingled in his eyes, at the vulnerability he was offering me, and I felt my own walls crumble completely. Yes, I said. Yes, I will marry you. Not because you have wealth or title or influence, but because you have shown me that love is not the opposite of work, but the reason for it. Because you have stood with me in the darkness and refused to let me face it alone. Because I cannot imagine a future without you in it. He kissed me then, and it was different from the first kiss, deeper and more certain, a promise sealed with breath and touch. And when we finally pulled apart, I saw Eleanor watching from the terrace, smiling with tears in her eyes, and I knew that she approved, that she understood what we had found in each other, that she was happy. We married in the summer, in a small ceremony attended only by Eleanor and a handful of friends who had stood by us through the trials. I wore a dress of ivory silk, simple and elegant, and the Duke wore a suit of charcoal gray, and when the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a completeness I had never thought possible. Not because I had become his property, as the law would have it, but because we had chosen each other, freely and fully, with all our flaws and scars and unfinished business. The laboratory in Ashcroft House became ours in truth, a shared space where we worked side by side, treating patients, refining the technology, pushing the boundaries of what science could do in service of healing. Eleanor joined us as a full partner, her insights invaluable, her presence a reminder of why we did the work. And slowly, patient by patient, we began to restore what the Prometheus Collective had taken. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. The device itself, the original prototype the Duke had brought to my workshop that first night, we destroyed. Together, we dismantled it piece by piece, melting the brass, shattering the glass, scattering the components so completely that it could never be rebuilt. And with it, we destroyed Hargrave's notes, the formulas, the blueprints for mass production. What remained of the technology existed only in my mind and in the carefully guarded records we kept for medical purposes. It would never again be used as a weapon. I would make certain of that. There were still threats, of course. Former members of the collective who had escaped prosecution, who harbored grudges and nursed plans for revenge. We received letters, warnings, veiled threats in the night. But we did not cower. We did not hide. We continued our work, protected by the Duke's influence and by the growing network of allies we had cultivated. Scientists and physicians who believed in the potential of the technology for good. Politicians who had seen the abuses and were determined to prevent their recurrence. Ordinary people who had been touched by the erasures and wanted justice. And in the quiet hours, when the work was done and the house settled into sleep, the Duke and I found time for ourselves, for conversations that lasted until dawn, for laughter that had been so long absent from both our lives, for the simple, profound intimacy of two people who had seen each other at their worst and had chosen to stay. We were not perfect. We argued, we doubted, we struggled with the weight of what we carried. But we were together, and that was enough. Years passed. Eleanor married a physician who had helped us in our work, a kind man who loved her for the person she had become rather than mourning the person she had been. Patients came and went, some restored, some forever changed, all of them testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The city continued to grow and evolve, its streets bright with electric lights and its factories humming with the pulse of progress. And through it all, I remained in my laboratory, in the house I now called home, working alongside the man I loved to ensure that the machine I had built would only ever bring light from darkness, never darkness from light. I learned in those years that redemption is not a destination, but a journey, that love is not the absence of fear, but the courage to be vulnerable despite it. That science, for all its power to harm, has an equal power to heal if wielded by hands that care. And I learned that the mistakes of the past do not define us unless we allow them to. We are more than the sum of what we have done. We are also what we choose to do next. On a night in autumn, many years after that first midnight when the Duke appeared in my laboratory holding the device I had hidden, I stood at the window of our bedroom and looked out over the city. The lights stretched to the horizon, a sea of glowing points in the darkness, each one representing a life, a story, a mind full of memories and dreams. And I thought about all the people we had helped, all the minds we had restored, all the futures we had saved. The Duke came to stand beside me, his arm around my waist, his presence as familiar and necessary as breath. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," I said, "that I was wrong all those years ago. I believed I could hide from the world, that I could keep my work secret, that I could avoid responsibility by avoiding connection. But the world found me anyway, and it taught me that the greatest machines we build are not made of brass and glass and wire. They are made of trust and courage and love. And those machines, once set in motion, can change everything." He smiled and pulled me closer. "You changed everything," he said. "You changed me." "We changed each other," I replied. "And we will continue to change, continue to grow, continue to fight for a world where science serves humanity rather than enslaving it. That is our work. That is our purpose. That is the promise we make to every person whose mind has been stolen and every person whose future we help reclaim." And so we continued, the Duke and I, Eleanor, and all those who joined us in the years that followed, building a legacy not of destruction, but of healing, not of erasure, but of restoration, not of machines that steal the soul, but of machines that illuminate it. We were not perfect, we were not without flaws, but we were trying, every day, to be better than we had been, to use what we knew in service of what we believed, to prove that even the darkest invention could be transformed into an instrument of light. The laboratory went dark at midnight, as it always did, the electric lights extinguishing one by one until only the glow of the city remained. And in that darkness, I felt the Duke's hand find mine, steady and sure, a connection that needed no light to guide it. We stood together at the threshold, between day and night, between past and future, between the machines we had built and the lives we had saved. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason or science, that we had found what we had been searching for all along, not perfection, not absolution, but something far more precious, a partnership forged in fire and tempered by time, a love that had survived the worst either of us could do and had emerged stronger for it, a purpose that gave meaning to every mistake and every triumph. The city breathed around us, electric and alive, and somewhere in its depths, a woman woke with memories returning. A man smiled at a face he finally recognized. A child laughed without knowing the danger they had been saved from. And I understood that this was the true work, not the invention, or the destruction, or the restoration, but the continuation, the choice to keep trying, keep hoping, keep building a world where light could emerge from even the darkest machine, where love could grow from even the most barren soil, where two broken people could find each other in the darkness and together create something whole. This was my legacy. This was our story. And it was not an ending, but a beginning, a promise written in light and shadow, in brass and flesh, in the electric pulse of the heart and the mechanical rhythm of the world. A promise that as long as we drew breath, as long as we had hands to build and minds to dream, we would never stop fighting for the light, never stop believing that science, when tempered by conscience and guided by love, could be the greatest machine of all, the machine that heals, the machine that restores, the machine that reminds us, again and again, what it means to be human. And so the laboratory went dark at midnight. But we did not fear the darkness. We had learned to carry our own light.